She walked into the $4 billion headquarters wearing a faded janitor's uniform, pushing a mop bucket across the marble lobby like she was nobody. Not a single executive recognized her. Not the vice president who passed her without a glance, not the security guard who barely nodded. Victoria Hale, the woman who built this empire from nothing, had become invisible inside her own company. She spent 30 days mopping floors and emptying trash cans. But what silenced the entire boardroom wasn't the billionaire's disguise. It was the moment she named her successor a black waitress from the company cafeteria. It started with a satisfying sense of irony. Victoria Hale had spent 30 years walking through these doors in tailored suits and Italian heels, and everyone had stood a little straighter when she passed. Now she shuffled through the same lobby in rubber-soled shoes and a shapeless gray uniform, and nobody looked at her at all. She had wanted to become invisible. She just hadn't expected how easy it would be. 3 months earlier, Victoria had collapsed during a board meeting. A minor stroke, the doctors said minor enough that she could recover, fully serious enough that she couldn't ignore it. She was 62 years old. She had built Hale Dynamics from a one-room office above a laundromat in Newark into a $4 billion technology empire. She had done it as an immigrant woman with no connections, no family money, and no safety net. And now, her own body was telling her it was time to let go. The board had been ready. Too ready, in fact. Within a week of her diagnosis, they had assembled a short list of CEO candidates, polished men with Ivy League MBAs and 20-year resumes at Fortune 500 companies. On paper, every single one of them was perfect, but Victoria had not survived 30 years in this industry by trusting what looked good on paper. Something felt wrong. The quarterly reports were too clean. Employee turnover had been creeping up for 18 months, and yet every executive summary described the company culture as thriving. Nobody thrived quietly while heading for the exits. So Victoria made a decision that her lawyers called reckless and her doctors called insane. She contacted the building's janitorial contractor, arranged a temporary placement under a fake name, and on a Monday evening in October, she clocked in for the night shift at her own headquarters. The first week taught her more than 5 years of board meetings ever had. She saw Derek Graves, the senior vice president of operations, berate a cleaning woman for leaving a streak on his office window. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He spoke to the woman the way someone speaks to a stain they want removed, with a cold, steady contempt that made clear he did not consider her fully human. The cleaning woman apologized 3 times. Graves never looked at her face. She saw Marcus Webb, the board's top candidate for CEO, corner a young black employee in a hallway after hours. The employee had apparently filed a complaint about a missed promotion. Webb told him in a voice that carried down the corridor that people who couldn't handle the culture should find somewhere else to work. He used the word fit. He said it twice. Victoria understood exactly what he meant by it. She saw budget proposals that slashed benefits for the company's lowest-paid workers while increasing executive bonuses by 40%. She read memos left carelessly on desks and in recycling bins that discussed workforce optimization, which was a polished way of saying they planned to fire the people who could least afford to lose their jobs. And then, on her 9th night, she met Naomi Carter. The company cafeteria stayed open until 10 for the night shift workers, and Naomi was the one who kept it running. She was a part-time server, 26 years old, working evenings so she could attend MBA classes during the day. Victoria sat at a corner table with a cup of coffee, and Naomi brought her a plate of food without being asked. "You're new," Naomi said. It wasn't a question. Victoria nodded. "Started last week. You eat yet tonight." Victoria shook her head, and Naomi set the plate down, grilled chicken rice vegetables, and pulled out the chair across from her like it was the most natural thing in the world to sit down with the night janitor. They talked for almost an hour. Or rather, Naomi talked and Victoria listened. Naomi was sharp, direct, and completely uninterested in being polite about what she saw happening in the company. She talked about how the old community scholarship program had been gutted the previous year. She talked about how 3 of the cafeteria workers had been cut to part-time to avoid providing health insurance. She talked about the gap between what the company said it valued and how it actually treated the people at the bottom. "This place used to mean something," Naomi said. "My mother used to tell me about companies that built things and took care of their people at the same time. I don't know if that was ever real, but I know it's not what's happening here." Victoria studied her. Naomi was not careful with her words. She didn't soften her opinions or hedge her criticisms. When a busboy dropped a tray of dishes behind the counter, Naomi snapped at him with a sharpness that surprised Victoria, then caught herself, walked over, helped him clean it up, and apologized. It was a small moment, but it told Victoria everything Naomi had fire, and she didn't always control it. Over the next few weeks, Victoria learned more. Naomi's mother, Gloria Carter, had worked for 23 years at a large manufacturing corporation before being laid off without severance during a merger. No warning, no explanation. No one had fought for her. Gloria had spent the rest of her working life piecing together part-time jobs, and Naomi had grown up watching her mother shrink not from poverty, but from the quiet devastation of being discarded by people who never learned her name. That wound lived in Naomi like an engine. It drove her to speak up, to fight, to refuse to look away. But it also made her reckless sometimes. She had already been written up twice for arguing with management. She questioned decisions that weren't hers to question. She defended people who hadn't asked for her defense. And underneath all that fire, Victoria sensed something fragile, a persistent doubt about whether someone like Naomi Carter truly belonged in the world of boardrooms and corner offices. Victoria recognized that doubt. She had carried the same one for 30 years. It was on day 16 that everything changed. Victoria was emptying trash bins on the executive floor when she overheard a conversation through a conference room door that hadn't fully closed. 2 voices she recognized both, Derek Graves and Marcus Webb. They were discussing the sale of 40% of Hale Dynamics shares to a foreign conglomerate. The numbers were staggering, a deal worth nearly $2 billion structured to trigger personal bonuses for every member of the executive team who approved the transaction. Graves mentioned alignment payments. Webb talked about offshore accounts. They spoke casually, the way men speak when they believe no one unimportant is listening. Victoria stood in the hallway with a trash bag in her hand and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not a negotiation she had authorized. This was not a strategy the board had disclosed to her. This was a betrayal, deliberate, coordinated, and already in motion. Her first instinct was to walk into that room, throw off the uniform, and shut it down. But she knew what would happen if she did. The board had already prepared for the possibility that she might resist their plans. 3 weeks after her stroke, the company's legal team had quietly inserted an emergency clause into the governance charter. If the founder was deemed mentally incapacitated, the board could suspend her voting rights and decision-making authority by a simple majority vote. If Victoria revealed herself now before she had evidence, they would use her stroke against her. They would call her confused. They would call her unstable. They would take her company from her and wrap it in legal language so clean that no court would question it. So she kept her mouth shut. She picked up the trash bag, pushed her cart down the hallway, and made a choice that would define everything that followed. She would stay invisible. She would keep watching. She would gather every piece of evidence she could find, and she would find the one person in this building who deserved to lead, not because of their resume, but because of who they were when they thought no one was paying attention. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria watched Naomi Carter the way a sculptor studies raw stone looking for the shape hidden inside. She saw Naomi break up an argument between 2 cafeteria workers over a scheduling conflict. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Dolores, had been assigned back-to-back closing shifts for the 3rd week in a row. The other, a younger man named Travis, refused to swap because he said he had seniority. Their manager had ignored the problem entirely. Naomi stepped in without being asked. She pulled the schedule up on the kitchen computer, rearranged 4 shifts so that the workload balanced out, and explained her reasoning to both of them in plain language. Dolores thanked her. Travis didn't, but he took the new schedule without complaint. It was a small thing, the kind of leadership that never appeared on performance reviews because nobody with authority was ever watching. But Victoria also saw the other side. A week later, Naomi discovered that a summer intern, a young black woman named Jasmine, had been repeatedly passed over for project assignments in favor of less experienced interns. When Naomi confronted the department supervisor about it, she didn't do it quietly. She did it in the middle of the cafeteria during the lunch rush, her voice rising with every sentence, her finger pointing at the man's chest, while 24 employees watched in uncomfortable silence. The supervisor turned red. Jasmine looked mortified. Naomi was right about the injustice, but the way she delivered her message left wreckage behind instead of resolution. Victoria watched from across the room, her mop resting against a table. She saw something she recognized in Naomi's fury, the same anger that had driven Victoria herself in the early years when every door had been closed in her face and every no had felt like an insult to everything she was. That kind of fire could change the world. It could also burn you alive if you never learned to aim it. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb was building his case for the CEO position with surgical precision. Victoria observed him present quarterly projections to a group of board members during a working dinner. The numbers were impressive: revenue growth of 12%, client retention, up, operational costs down. But Victoria had spent 3 decades reading financial reports, and something about these figures didn't sit right. The margins were too clean. The projections aligned too perfectly with what the board wanted to hear. She couldn't prove it yet, but she was certain Marcus was massaging the data, smoothing out the rough edges to make himself look like the only logical choice. On day 22, Victoria found out what the share sale would actually cost. She was cleaning the executive conference room after hours when she found a printed memo that someone had left inside a leather portfolio. It was a draft impact assessment marked "Confidential Internal Only," outlining the consequences of the proposed deal with the foreign conglomerate. The numbers were devastating. 30% of the workforce would be eliminated within 18 months. The community scholarship program that Victoria had personally funded for 15 years would be dissolved. The Employee Wellness Initiative, the after-school tutoring partnerships, the annual grants to local nonprofits, all of it would be cut to satisfy the new shareholders' demand for higher margins. Victoria read the memo standing up, still holding her cleaning rag. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her uniform. This was no longer about finding the right CEO. This was about saving everything she had spent her life building. 2 days later, Naomi was fired. The official reason was insubordination and repeated violation of workplace conduct policies. The real reason, as far as Victoria could piece together, was the cafeteria incident with Jasmine's supervisor. The supervisor had filed a formal complaint, and the HR director, a man who reported directly to Marcus Webb, had fast-tracked the termination. Naomi was given 15 minutes to collect her belongings and escorted out of the building by security. Victoria was mopping the lobby when it happened. She watched Naomi walk past her with a cardboard box in her arms, her jaw set tight, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't argue with the guards. She walked out of the glass doors into the October night and didn't look back. Something cracked inside Victoria that evening. She had seen talented people pushed out before it was the ugliest part of corporate life, and she had never fully made peace with it. But watching Naomi leave felt different. It felt personal. Because Victoria knew with a certainty she couldn't explain on a spreadsheet that the woman they had just thrown away was worth more than every executive on the 42nd floor combined. That night alone in the cafeteria after closing, Victoria sat at the same corner table where she had first spoken with Naomi. The question that had been forming for weeks finally crystallized: if the next leader of this company was someone who only cared about profit, then everything Victoria had built, every scholarship, every community program, every principle she had fought for, would be erased within a year. The share sale wasn't just a business transaction. It was an erasure of her legacy, and the people who stood to lose the most were the ones who had never had a seat at the table. She didn't know it yet, but Naomi was sitting in her apartment across the city staring at the same darkness from the other side. Naomi had gone home, set the cardboard box on her kitchen counter, and sat on the edge of her bed without turning on the lights. The anger had burned out somewhere between the parking lot and the bus stop, and what was left underneath was something worse, a familiar, suffocating weight that she had spent her entire adult life trying to outrun. She thought about her mother. Gloria Carter had given 23 years to a company that forgot her name the day she was let go. Gloria had done everything right, showed up early, stayed late, never complained, and it hadn't mattered. They had thrown her away like she was nothing, and Gloria had spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild something that could never quite hold her weight again. Now here was Naomi sitting in the dark, wondering if she had inherited her mother's curse. She fought, she spoke up, she refused to look away. And every single time the result was the same, she ended up on the outside holding a box of her own things, watching the door close behind her. Maybe the world was telling her something. Maybe people like her weren't meant to be in those rooms. Maybe the fire in her chest wasn't a gift, it was just a faster way to get burned. She almost decided to walk away from all of it that night. Almost. Back at Hale Dynamics, things were unraveling. Someone on the executive team had discovered that internal documents were being accessed after hours from terminals on the executive floor that weren't assigned to any current employee. Derek Graves raised the alarm during an emergency leadership meeting, and Marcus Webb immediately ordered a full internal investigation. They began reviewing security camera footage. They pulled access records from the janitorial contractor. And within 48 hours, Marcus Webb himself noticed something that made him pick up the phone and call the head of building security. The woman on the night cleaning crew didn't match any employee in the company's HR system. Her contractor ID had been processed through an outside agency, and the name on file, Ellen Monroe, returned no social security match, no tax records, no employment history. She was a ghost. Webb didn't know who she was, but he knew she didn't belong. At the same time, someone needed to take the blame for the leaked information, and Naomi Carter was the most convenient target. She had already been fired for insubordination. She had openly criticized management. She had access to the cafeteria, which shared a service corridor with the executive wing. Within a day, the company's legal team sent Naomi a formal cease and desist letter accusing her of theft of confidential corporate information and threatening civil litigation if she didn't cooperate with the investigation. Naomi sat at her kitchen table reading the letter, and for the first time since she was fired, she felt something other than defeat. She felt furious. Not the reckless, combustible fury that had gotten her into trouble before, something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Because Naomi knew something that the legal team didn't know she knew. During her time in the cafeteria, the company's internal email system had occasionally misdirected messages. It was a known glitch, something about the server routing for the food services department overlapping with the executive distribution list. Most of the cafeteria staff deleted the misfired emails without reading them. Naomi had not. She had saved every single one. Not because she was planning anything, not because she was building a case. She saved them because her mother had taught her, without ever saying the words, that when powerful people decide you're disposable, the only thing that protects you is proof. Gloria Carter had been fired without a single document to fight back with. Her daughter would not make the same mistake. Naomi didn't know yet what those emails contained. She hadn't read most of them carefully. But she had them dozens of messages between senior executives discussing the share sale, the bonus structure, the workforce reduction plan, and the legal strategy for neutralizing Victoria Hale. She closed the cease and desist letter, set it on the table, and did nothing. Not yet. On day 29, Victoria made her move. She requested an emergency session with the board of directors, appearing not as Ellen Monroe, the janitor, but as Victoria Hale, founder, majority shareholder, and the woman whose name was carved into the granite above the front entrance. The boardroom went silent when she walked in. She was wearing the same suit she had worn to the last meeting before her stroke, and she carried a folder containing every piece of evidence she had gathered over the past month. Memos, recorded conversations, financial discrepancies, the confidential impact assessment of the share sale. She laid it all on the table. She named names. She cited dates, dollar amounts, offshore accounts. She looked Marcus Webb in the eye and told him she had heard every word he said in that conference room on day 16. For exactly 11 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Marcus Webb smiled. He reached into his briefcase and produced a single document, the emergency governance clause that Victoria had feared since the beginning. He read it aloud slowly, making sure every board member heard each word. If the founder was deemed mentally incapacitated due to a medical condition, the board could suspend her authority by a simple majority vote. All they needed was a medical opinion. Dr. Raymond Ellis, the company's chief medical officer, stood up from his seat at the far end of the table. Victoria had never trusted Ellis. He was a political animal who owed his position to Derek Graves, but she hadn't expected him to lie so boldly. Ellis stated in a calm and clinical voice that based on Victoria's recent medical history and her erratic behavior over the past several weeks, including assuming a false identity and conducting unauthorized surveillance, it was his professional opinion that she was not cognitively fit to exercise executive authority. Marcus called for an immediate vote. 7 hands went up in favor of suspension. 3 remained down. Victoria Hale, the woman who had built a $4 billion empire from nothing, was stripped of her authority in her own boardroom by the people she had made rich. Security was called. 2 guards entered the room and asked her to leave. She didn't fight. She didn't shout. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the room with the same posture she had carried every day for 30 years. The hallway was empty. Victoria sat down on a bench near the elevator, the same bench she had rested on during her night shifts when her back ached from mopping. The building hummed around her, indifferent. A security guard stood 6 feet away, watching her like she was a trespasser in the house she had built with her own hands. She took out her phone and called Naomi. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She stared at the screen for a long time, then lowered the phone to her lap. For the first time in 30 years, Victoria Hale did not know what to do next. She had no authority, no allies in that room, and the one person she believed in wasn't answering. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had signed the company's founding documents, that had shaken hands with presidents and senators and titans of industry, that had spent the last month gripping a mop handle in the dark. She began to stand ready to walk out of the building and into whatever came next, ready for the first time in her life to accept that she had lost. Across the city, Naomi Carter was sitting on the floor of her apartment with her back against the bed, staring at her phone. 2 missed calls from an unknown number. She had watched it ring both times and done nothing. The cease and desist letter from Hale Dynamics sat on the kitchen table where she had left it 3 days ago. Next to it, a stack of bills she couldn't pay until her next freelance check came through. The cardboard box from her last day at the cafeteria was still on the counter unopened. She hadn't touched it. Opening it would mean admitting that chapter was real, that she had fought and lost, and been thrown out just like her mother. Naomi pulled up the voicemail. No message. She almost set the phone down, but something about the timing unsettled her. She thought about the janitor, the older woman she had shared meals with in the cafeteria, the one who listened more than she talked, the one whose eyes carried a weight that didn't match her uniform. Naomi had never asked her name. She realized now that she had never needed to. Something about that woman had felt like recognition, like looking into a mirror that showed you who you could become if the world gave you half a chance. She set the phone on the floor beside her and looked across the room at the shelf above the television. Her mother's photograph sat there in a cheap wooden frame, Gloria Carter at 40, standing in front of the factory where she had worked for more than 2 decades, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Naomi had taken that photo on a disposable camera the summer before the layoff. She had been 9 years old. She hadn't understood then why her mother's smile looked borrowed, like something she was wearing for the picture and would take off as soon as the shutter clicked. Now Naomi understood perfectly. Gloria had known even then that she was replaceable, that the building behind her would keep standing long after she was gone, and that nobody inside it would remember she had ever been there. Naomi closed her eyes. The smart thing to do was nothing. Walk away. Don't get involved. The company had already threatened to sue her. She had no money for a lawyer, no allies inside the building, and no reason to believe that anything she did would make a difference. People like her didn't win these fights. Her mother hadn't. Her mother's mother hadn't. The pattern was older than Naomi, and it would outlast her. But then she thought about Jasmine, the intern she had defended in the cafeteria, the one whose face had gone tight with shame when nobody else in the room said a word. She thought about Dolores, who worked double shifts and never complained because complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought about the janitor who had sat across from her in the empty cafeteria and listened to her talk about a company losing its soul, and who had looked at her not with pity, but with something that felt dangerously close to belief. Naomi opened her eyes. She reached under her bed and pulled out her laptop. She had saved the misdirected emails in a folder she hadn't opened in months, dozens of messages between executives she had never met discussing deals she hadn't understood at the time. She opened the first one and started reading, then the second, then the third. By the 10th email, her hands were shaking, not from fear, from clarity. She was looking at the entire architecture of the share sale, internal memos between Marcus Webb and Derek Graves, bonus calculations tied to the closing of the deal, a timeline for workforce reductions, and most damning of all, a thread discussing how to manage the founder's transition using the emergency governance clause. One email, sent 5 weeks before Victoria's stroke had even happened, outlined a legal strategy for removing her from power in the event that she resisted. They had been planning this before she ever got sick. The stroke hadn't created the opportunity, it had simply given them the excuse. Naomi printed everything, 47 pages. She put them in a manila folder, put on her coat, and walked out the door. She didn't think about what would happen when she got there. She didn't rehearse a speech or calculate the odds. She simply understood with a bone-deep certainty that she had inherited from her mother and transformed into something Gloria never could, that she was done sitting in the dark waiting for permission to matter. The security desk at Hale Dynamics almost stopped her. The guard on duty recognized her face from the termination file and reached for his radio. But before he could key in a word, the elevator behind the desk opened, and Arthur Grimes stepped out. He was 71 years old, had been on the board since the company's founding, and had just watched Victoria Hale get escorted out of her own boardroom. He had come downstairs to find her, and instead he found Naomi standing in the lobby with a manila folder pressed against her chest. Grimes looked at the guard. "She's coming with me." The guard hesitated. Grimes didn't repeat himself. He held the elevator door open, and Naomi stepped inside. They rode up in silence. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, Grimes glanced at the folder in Naomi's hands. "Is that what I think it is?" Naomi met his eyes. "It's worse." Grimes nodded once, then walked down the hallway and pushed open the boardroom doors. Every head turned. Marcus Webb was standing at the head of the table with a pen in his hand, a stack of transfer documents spread in front of him. The share sale was minutes from being signed. Derek Graves sat to his right, arms crossed, looking satisfied. Dr. Raymond Ellis was reviewing something on his phone. Marcus saw Naomi first. His expression shifted from surprise to contempt in less than a second. "This woman was terminated. Get security." Grimes cut in before anyone moved. "We're about to sign a deal that will reshape this company for the next 20 years. If someone has material information, we have a fiduciary obligation to hear it. Sit down, Marcus." Naomi walked to the center of the room. She set the manila folder on the table and opened it. Her hands were trembling, and she didn't try to hide it. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. Her voice was unsteady, and she let it be. "I'm not an executive. For the past 2 years, I served coffee in the cafeteria downstairs, and not one person in this room knows my name. But I know how to read, and I know the difference between right and wrong." She held up the first email. It was a message from Marcus Webb to Derek Graves dated 6 weeks before Victoria's stroke, outlining a strategy to invoke the Emergency Governance Clause and describing Victoria's potential medical event as she read the exact words, "a favorable development for transition planning." The room shifted. 2 board members exchanged a glance. Marcus stood up, his face rigid. "Those are stolen documents. They're inadmissible and illegally obtained." Naomi looked at him. "They were sent to my work terminal by your own email server. I didn't steal anything. Your system gave them to me," she continued. She laid out the bonus structure tied to the share sale personal payments exceeding $12 million split among 5 executives. She pointed to discrepancies between the quarterly projections Marcus had presented to the board and the internal figures from the same period, showing that revenue growth had been inflated by nearly 4%. She stumbled over one of the financial terms and corrected herself mid-sentence. She misread a date and had to go back. She was not polished. She was not smooth. But she was right, and the evidence in front of her was impossible to ignore. When she finished, Naomi looked directly at the board members who had voted to suspend Victoria. "The problem was never her health," she said. "The problem is that you were afraid of losing your privileges." Nobody responded. Marcus Webb's pen was still in his hand, but he had stopped writing. Victoria walked into the room behind Naomi. Grimes had sent for her while Naomi was speaking. She carried no folder, no documents. Instead, she spoke from memory dates, conversations, details she had gathered over 30 nights of cleaning offices and emptying trash cans. She described the conversation she had overheard on day 16 between Webb and Graves. She recounted the exact language Derek Graves had used when berating a cleaning woman over a window streak. She described the budget memos she had found in recycling bins, the ones that slashed worker benefits while padding executive compensation. 2 separate bodies of evidence, Victoria's from inside the building, Naomi's from the misdirected emails, converged on the same conclusion. The share sale was not a strategic business decision. It was a self-enrichment scheme designed to benefit 5 men at the expense of thousands of employees. Arthur Grimes called for a new vote. Marcus demanded his lawyer. Graves tried to leave the room, but the evidence was too heavy, the documentation too specific, and the faces around the table had already changed. Dr. Ellis quietly excused himself and did not return. The board voted to suspend the share sale immediately. A second vote removed Marcus Webb and Derek Graves from their positions pending a full independent investigation. Security escorted both men from the building within the hour. When the room had cleared, Victoria stood at the head of the table, her table in her company, in the building she had raised from nothing. She looked at the remaining board members, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and unhurried. "I mopped the floors of this building for 30 days. I cleaned your offices. I emptied your trash. And in 30 days, I saw who screams at the staff, who falsifies numbers, who takes bribes. I also saw who treats an old janitor like a human being. The only person in this building who led with integrity wasn't any of you." She turned to Naomi. "I'm nominating Naomi Carter as interim CEO." The reaction was immediate and fierce. One board member called it absurd. Another said the shareholders would revolt. A third pointed out that Naomi had no executive experience, no track record, and had been employed as a part-time cafeteria server until 2 weeks ago. Victoria listened to all of it. Then she answered with a single sentence. "You said the same things about me 30 years ago." The room went quiet. Arthur Grimes asked Naomi if she had anything to say. Naomi stood up. She didn't have a presentation. She didn't have a 5-year strategic plan printed on glossy paper. She had 5 minutes and the truth. She talked about people first. The company's greatest asset wasn't its technology or its client list, it was the thousands of workers who showed up every day and kept the machine running. Cutting 30% of them wouldn't save the company. It would gut it from the inside and leave nothing but a shell. She talked about trust. Customers didn't stay because of low prices. They stayed because they believed in the brand. The share sale would destroy that belief overnight, and no amount of marketing could rebuild it. And then she asked a question that nobody in the room expected. She looked at the board and said, "If the woman who built everything you're sitting here enjoying tells you this company needs to change direction, how many more MBA degrees do you need before you'll listen?" The silence that followed filled the room like weight. Arthur Grimes called the vote. 6 in favor, 4 against. Naomi Carter was approved as interim CEO on a 12-month probationary term. Not a unanimous victory, not a standing ovation. A narrow margin from a skeptical board that was giving her a chance, not a coronation. Naomi stood in the boardroom after the vote alone, except for Victoria. The building was quiet. The evening had settled over the city outside the windows, and the lights of the skyline reflected off the glass like scattered embers. "I don't know if I can do this," Naomi said. Victoria looked at her, this 26-year-old woman, who had walked into a room full of powerful men with shaking hands and a manila folder, and had chosen to speak when silence would have been safer. "I didn't know either," Victoria said. 30 years ago, I stood in a room just like this one, and every person at the table told me I didn't belong. I believed them for about 10 seconds. Then I got to work." 6 months later, Naomi Carter sat in the CEO's office on the 42nd floor. The room had been redecorated. She had taken down the oil paintings and replaced them with framed photos of company employees at community events. Every morning before her first meeting, she took the elevator to the ground floor and had coffee in the cafeteria with whoever was working the early shift. The staff called her by her first name. She called them by theirs. Employee turnover had dropped by 35%. The community scholarship program had been restored. Profits hadn't skyrocketed, they had stabilized. And for the first time in 3 years, the company's internal satisfaction surveys showed that people believed in where they worked again. Naomi still made mistakes. The board still challenged her. She stayed up late more nights than she didn't, staring at spreadsheets and second-guessing decisions and wondering if the doubters were right. But she showed up every morning, and she didn't quit. Victoria Hale came by the office once a week. She never sat in the CEO's chair. She sat across the desk in the visitor's seat and offered advice only when asked. She watched Naomi grow into the role the way a gardener watches a tree take root patiently, knowing that the strongest growth happens where you can't see it. One evening, as Victoria was leaving, she stopped at the door and looked back. Naomi was bent over a report, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. She looked exhausted and determined and completely alive. Victoria smiled and walked out without saying a word. She didn't need to. She had spent 30 years building a company. Now she had found someone who would build it into something better. Leadership was never about the degree on your wall or the name on your family tree. It was about how you treated the invisible people, the ones who mopped your floors and served your coffee and cleaned up after you when you believed no one important was watching. Someone was always watching.